Hi guys, welcome back. Today is, well, this video only will cover Unit 2 of AP Economics. So Unit 2 is simply supply and demand, just a little more information. There'll be multiple videos. And so yeah, today's video, hopefully not too long, will just be Unit 2. Let me share my screen so that you gain access to it. So here, demand. What is supply and what is demand? Well, first of all, why don't we define the very two important laws that govern supply and demand? That is the law of supply and the law of demand. Okay? The law of supply says as prices rise, as price rise, well, you know what? There's a positive relation with prices with respect to quantity supplied in the market. The law of demand is the opposite relation, and so decrease in quantity between prices and quantity. Okay, cool. It's smaller, and so graphically, you know, demand curve is downward sloping, and the supply curve is upward sloping. We're going to have prices on the y-axis, and quantity on the x-axis. And you're probably wondering why. Well, this is by convention in the economics field. We put prices on the y and quantity on the x, even though universally should be the opposite, but it's by convention, so just take it how it is. And so the intersection between supply and demand is our market equilibrium. So that will yield us P star, which is the market's equilibrium price, and Q star, indicating the market equilibrium quantity. Demand curve slopes downwards due to three reasons. That is the income effect, the substitution effect, and diminishing marginal returns. Okay, so three reasons why it slopes down. What else do I want to mention? These curves shift left or right depending on the factors that affect the curves. For example, the demand curve will shift, so changes in demands, changes and demand will shift the curve left or right, right? So it's an actual shift. So there are multiple reasons. I'm just going to label a few. That could be changes of delta, triangle, of related goods. So that could be goods. They're broken down into complements and substitutes. Another one, changes in income, right? Again, income, there are two types of goods in relation to income. There is normal and inferior goods. Okay, so these are just a few shifts, a few factors that can shift the demand curve. And what I mean by that is, for example, if let's say the price of related goods, there's a change in that. So for example, if this is the price of chocolate, or if the market for chocolate in this graph and the price of candy significantly drop, what should you expect the market for chocolate to react? How should it react? Well, the consumers are not going to buy as much chocolate because the price of candy is cheaper, and both goods are substitutable, and so the demand for chocolate will shift to the left. And so the new intersection between the demand curve, the new demand curve, and the old supply curve is the new market equilibrium. Cool. So why don't we do changes in supply? So that could be changes in input prices. So if oil, there's a significant collapse in oil prices, or if the price of raw materials drops, then it makes cost production cheaper. And so consumer or suppliers want to produce more because they can make more money, right? Maybe change in number of suppliers. The more suppliers in the markets, the more firms entering into that market, that means there's more production. So the supplier curve will shift to the right. Cool. So yeah, there's multiple other factors. I highly suggest you review that. And so with that said, you have to make a distinction between changes in supply / demand versus changes in quantity supplied and quantity demanded. That's very important. So make a distinction between demand supply versus changes in quantity supplied. You're probably wondering what's the difference. Changes in quantity demanded or quantity supplied are related to changes in the price of that good. So if, again, we're talking about the market for chocolate, if the price of chocolate increases with respect to what's happening on the demand curve, what happens? Demand does not shift left to right, but there's a movement along the demand curve. That movement is signified by a change in quantity demanded. For example, if the new price of chocolate in the market is P3, well, that will yield a lesser amount of quantity being consumed. That lesser amount of quantity is signified by, let's say, Q3 units, which is a change in quantity demanded. So we move up along the demand curve, okay? So again, changes in demand versus changes in quantity demanded or supply. Very important. What else is there? And so, with that said, you can also have simultaneous shifts in supply and demand. So what that means is you can have the supply curve shifting to the right and demand curve shifting to the right as well. So draw a line. Simultaneous demand supply. Okay. So I'm not going to go over each case, but there are multiple cases. There is demand shift up, supply shift up. Conversely, you could have demand shift down, supply shift down. Or third, you could have demand increase, supply decrease, or you can have demand decrease, supply increase. Each of these situations will yield an ambiguous result, meaning it is hard to quantify if it's hard to quantify, it's impossible at this level to quantify if the exact effects on quantity and prices in that market. So what I mean by that is, let's say we take an example of a simultaneous demand and supply to the right, or an increase. Demand and supply. So again, let's say demand shifts up by a lot, and then there's a marginal shift in supply. Whereas in the equilibrium, it's going to be right here, right? Off the bat, what can we conclude? Well, the new equilibrium price and the new equilibrium quantity are higher values, okay? So in conclusion, if there's a simultaneous shift in supply and demand to the right, quantity in that market increases, price in the market increases. However, it all depends on the magnitude of the curve's shifts. So if price and quantity, so that's demand. What if instead of demand shifting by a lot, supply shifted by, I don't know, some crazy amount, and demand, there's a marginal shift in demand. So what is our new equilibrium? Excuse my poorly drawn graphs. So the new equilibrium is S2 and D2. And so that yields us, oopsies, I want P2 prices and Q2 quantity. What can we conclude from this graph? Quantity increases and prices actually decrease. So in both scenarios, quantity increases, but the price in that market is ambiguous. You don't know what happens, exactly what happens. It depends on the magnitude of the shifts. And so each case, 1, 2, 3, and 4 will have a similar result. For example, 2 off the bat is going to be the exact opposite. So prices so if supply and demand decrease, so I think sometimes, even I get confused. Quantity decreases and price is indeterminate, depends on the magnitude. 3 and 4 will have the inverse results. So quantity will be ambiguous, but prices will be more determined. Duh. English. So yeah, be wary of that. That's a bit difficult. So with that said, these demand curves and supply curves that I'm showing you, they all look identical. They all look like they have the same slope, but in reality, demand curves can vary in shapes and supply curves. And so the next topic is called elasticity. So elasticity is simply the responsiveness of the demand and supply in terms of quantity with changes in price. So the more elastic, the more sensitive the price, the demand or supply is. The more inelastic, the less sensitive. For example, if I change the price of a good by like 1%, and then there's like a 1,000,000% change in quantity consumed in the market, we would say that that good is highly elastic. It's very sensitive to price changes. However, let's say the price of vaccines increases by 10%, well, people are still going to buy vaccines. So that is said to be relatively inelastic. And so it's very insensitive to price changes. So okay. There is price elasticity of demand. Very straightforward formula. Percent change in quantity of X over percent change in price of X. Take the absolute value of that. The value is greater than 1, it's elastic. It's equal to 1, it's elastic. If it is less than 1, it is inelastic. You could have extreme cases such as perfectly inelastic, perfectly elastic, and yeah, those are the far ends of the spectrum there. So what are the determinants of what constitutes an elastic good? Well, if there are many substitutes, it'll be more elastic. If it's a luxury, it's more elastic. If it's more of a necessity, it's more inelastic, right? So it really depends on, is there a lot of substitutes? Is it a necessity or is it a luxury? It's not the only elasticity formula you're going to use. It could be cross price elasticity, X to Y, so it's cross price elasticity. That is pretty straightforward. Percent change in quantity of V over the percent change in P of A. If this value is positive, then that is said to be a substitute. Okay. If it is negative, we're not taking the absolute value. Okay. It is a complement. Complement. So substitute chocolate and candy. Complements ice skates and skate sharpie. Buy one, you buy the other. 3. Income elasticity. So that is pretty much if your income increases or decreases, do you buy more of a good? So that we're going to do I to the X as a notation. So that is percent change in Q of X over percent change in If it's positive, it's a normal good. So when your income rises, you buy more of it. If it is negative, it is an inferior good, maybe like incinerados. So when your income rises, you buy less of it. Kind of sad. And that's pretty much it in terms of, I guess, graphically, how these curves look like. So in terms of demand, this would be a relatively elastic. Relatively inelastic. This would be, the red would be perfectly elastic. This is perfectly inelastic. Cool beans. One thing to not really summarize is the concept of the total revenue test. And so what is total revenue? Total revenue is price times quantity. And don't mix it up with profit. They're very different things. It looks like my internet just kaput. There we are, back to business. So imagine total revenue test is simply a test to determine if your demand is inelastic or elastic or elastic. So what I mean by that is the demand curve can be broken down into three regions. You got your elastic region, then you got your unit elastic, so your PEP one, and then you got your unit elastic. To comprende. Terrible French. Anyways, so total revenue is simply a curve illustrating that as you increase quantity or you sell more units, your total revenue will increase. But because of diminishing returns and whatnot, there's going to be a maximum to that curve, and then followed by a decline in total revenue. So it looks like this. Sure. So this is total revenue, this is quantity. And so what is important here is two things. Is if price increases, right, and this causes total revenue to increase, well, let's think of it. If price increases, total revenue increases, then your demand is set to be inelastic, right? So you can think of it as being on this portion of the curve, or you could be going up on a total revenue curve, right? If price increases and it causes total revenue to decrease, then it's elastic. Obviously, you could do the exact opposite. Price decreases, yeah. So that could be. So the maximum of the total revenue curve corresponds to the unit elastic part of the demand curve. Cool beans. So that is pretty much it. Jacob Clifford, a great economics teacher, has a pretty cool way of remembering this. It's like hand movements, but I can't remember it off my bat. I remember watching him when I was a student. Okay, that is a total revenue test. And the next topic that leads right off in surplus. Okay, this is pretty much a look at your market and supply. Intersection yields us equilibrium price, P star and Q star price. You don't want to get too lazy here. So consumer surplus is simply each person's, we're talking about markets, consumer surplus. So each person has their own individual consumer surplus. How is that determined? Well, it is their willingness to pay subtracted by the price paid in the market. For example, if I go to Sobeys and I'm willing to pay $2 per apple, but it's actually 75 cents per apple, well, I'm going to gain some savings. That savings in economics, we call it surplus. So when you add up each individual person's individual consumer surplus, you get the market surplus, which is this area here. This is consumer surplus. Producer surplus, very similar. What you're going to do is you're going to take each individual producer. You do the difference between the price they sell versus the lowest price that they're willing to sell, which is pretty much their production cost, and you sum that up. So what you're going to get. That is important. Perfectly competitive or perfect markets, efficient markets, will lead to what's called efficiency. And what this means is we are maximizing the consumer surplus in that market, or the surplus in that market. And essentially, at this point of the intersection, yes, it is allocated efficiency because consumers value the product at the cost of production of the last unit. And so when this exchange occurs, it's said to be efficient or allocatively efficient, which we will talk more about it in units 3 or 4, I think. So if these are the benefits received to consumers and producers in a natural, I guess, economy, like what happens when you interfere in that economy? So what I mean by that is governments can set minimum wages, it can set price floors, price ceiling. Our price floor is set above the equilibrium price in the market. You think of it as minimum wage. So it is the minimum price charged in the market. So this is a price floor. Price floor leads to surpluses because if that is the minimum price, if the minimum price is higher than the equilibrium price, consumers want to produce more, but consumers don't want to buy as much because it's a higher price. So there's a surplus. Conversely, a price ceiling would be the exact opposite. The price ceiling is set below the equilibrium price, and this is the maximum price charged in the market. This creates a shortage. Because now that the price is lower than the market equilibrium, more people want to buy that product. And so more people want to buy it. Consumers don't want to produce as much because it's a lower price now. So you get a shortage. And as a result, when this happens, it's going to create this concept called deadweight loss. So deadweight loss is, you can think of it as loss of efficiency. And so let's assume it's either a price ceiling or price floor. Let's say the price floor is that this will be the market equilibrium price. Deadweight loss will be a triangle between the demand, supply, and the equilibrium at the new equilibrium price P2. So it's this little triangle here. That is deadweight loss. Cool. And so, yeah, I would review that very quickly. And so as you can see, these type of controls in the market are not very efficient. They actually are inefficient. They take away from surplus in the market. So almost done here. Just let me see how we are doing for time. Okay, so next is taxes. Creating inefficiency in the market. And so this leads to burden of the tax. So taxes, you can impose them on the supplier or the consumer, price and quantity. So the trick here is when the government imposes a tax, whatever the tax amount is, you're going to shift the supply curve or the demand curve up by that amount of the tax. So let's say this is the market for, I don't know, chocolate. The government sets a tax on the suppliers for $1. So the supply curve shifts up by $1. So the vertical shift. So what ends up happening is the new intersection here is price in the market P3. Let's call this P2. This is Q1, right? And so P3 is what's called the price to buyers. If I translate that point down on the old supply curve, let's call this P1. P2, right? This, that's not even close to P2. This is the price to sellers. This is the price they receive less the tax. So P3 is the price that they receive with the tax. This little box formed right over here, this is the tax revenue. Anything above here or here is the consumer surplus. This is the producer surplus. Lastly, that little triangle formed right here, that is your deadweight loss. So now, because both of these, both the supply and demand are relatively the same in shape, they're both like unit elastic. What ends up happening here is the burden of the tax is pretty much the same. But in our case here, to find the burden of the tax, you go to your old equilibrium point here. It's called A, this is B. You translate that point onto this, the y-axis, so prices, and you essentially split that BOC, tax revenue, into two portions. The upper portion here, that's going to be, so let me use red here, right? That is going to be consumer burden. And then right over here, this is your producer burden. Right? So that's what we call the burden of the tax, burden of tax. And so the next part to this is what happens if the elasticities of the supply and demand curve differ. So I'll just focus on demand. If demand is more inelastic, if demand is more inelastic, tax burden falls on consumers. If demand is more elastic, well, you guessed it, tax burden falls on producers. Again, inelastic demand, such as vaccines, if you tax the good, consumers still need it, so they'll be forced to pay more of the tax. If the good is like chocolate, well, because if the price of chocolate increases, well, consumers in that market easily substitute it towards, I don't know, candy or bubble tea. So that's the essence of it. And the last but not least to this is productivity, consumer utility, and choice, right? And so when consumers consume more good, they gain satisfaction from it, but the rate at which satisfaction increases when they increase consumption decreases. This idea of increasing but decreasing rate of satisfaction is called diminishing marginal utility. And so consumers obviously just don't eat one or consume one good and service. They typically consume more than one good and service. In economics, it's very hard to look at all of these factors. So in our analysis of consumer choice, we typically limit it to two goods. So if a consumer will choose between good A and B, how do they determine that? So this is our next topic. Maximization. Right? Why would I use red? Why would they, how would they determine to maximize utility? Well, between choosing two goods? Well, they're going to use this rule. It's called consumer optimizing bundle rule. I don't know, some jargon. So essentially the margin utility of A. So margin utility is the incremental utility that you receive from consuming one more good, and over the price of A is equal to the margin utility of B over the price of B, subject to your income, right? For example, I'm going to a grocery store at $30. I need to buy apples and oranges. How am I going to maximize my utility of buying apples and oranges? Well, I need to look at essentially the per dollar utility received for good A and the per dollar you received from good B. And I want to make sure that these are equal subject to my income. By doing this, I'm going to maximize my total utility. So why don't I bring up an example? Just give me 1 second. I'm wearing contacts and it's starting to like fade. Like starting to be like out of focus. So let me see if I can copy paste this example. Oh my god, it's so small. What happened? Why is it so small? Yeah, I have to zoom in. It's like, whoa, what happened here? But that's fine. The show must go on. So here we have a table. This is one of the most typical problems you'll get in an AP exam, right? So let's say your income, you have $30. You have a choice between good A and good B. The question might ask you, figure out the optimal consumption bundle of good A and B. Well, to do that, you need to figure out the margin utility per dollar. So I'm going to do X over the price of X. So 120 divided by 4 is 30. Yeah, you know what? Oh, 80 divided by 4 is 20. This is 10. This is 8. This is 4, and it's 1. Am I right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, right. So good at math. This is 15, 10, 8, 4, 2, 1. Yeah, I got it, guys. I did some math. So this is MUY over PY. So I have $3. Again, what are we trying to do here? I want to figure out the optimal bundle between optimal consumption bundle of good A and B that will maximize my total utility subject to my income of $30. So which combination, how many X, how many Ys do I need to choose to gain the highest utility such that I use all my income? Very easy. Okay, very easy. This tells us the margin utility per dollar, right? Margin utility per dollar. If I want to spend my first few dollars as a rational person, what should I spend it on? Well, I'll spend it on whichever good provides me the highest margin utility per dollar. So good X will provide me that. So I spend my first few dollars on good X. So what's the next step? I ask the same question, which provides me the highest margin utility per dollar? Good Y or good X? Well, I've already consumed the first unit of good X. So it's either the second unit of good X or the first unit of good Y. Well, clearly, the second unit of good X yields a higher dollar return. So rinse and repeat. Good Y yields a higher margin utility per dollar. Both good X at 3 units of X and 2 units of Y, I'm going to buy both because they both yield the same margin utility per dollar, and I'm still within my budget limits or my budget constraint. I'm going to buy the same thing here. And so now, how much income do I have left over? This is 6. This is 4 times 4 is 16. 6, 16 is 22. So I have $22. So I still have a few more dollars left over. So I'll buy this and this. So that is 22 plus 4 is 24, plus 2, which is 28. So $2 left over. This is pretty convenient because the next unit I'll buy is good Y, which is exactly $2, which leads us to exhaust all of our income. Right? So this is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. This is 10. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is 20. And this is $30. And so this consumption bundle at 5x and 5y, at 5xy, 5x and 5y, this will maximize total surplus. And I dare you, choose any combination of goods that satisfies our income, and it shouldn't. I know for a fact it will not be higher than the total surplus received at this optimal consumption bundle. With that said, that's all I have for today. Again, I don't want to do everything in one video, then it just becomes a mess and it becomes so long, and it's better to break it down. So stay tuned for my next video, and thank you for paying attention.